Okay, welcome to Lecture 5. This is Pilgrims and Puritans, and in this lecture we are going to cover more English settlement, but this time the settlement is going to be in regards to New England, so the area that we now know as sort of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, up there, because there's going to be a very different group of people, very different group of English colonists that are going to settle in this region. So who are they? Who are the folks that are going to populate this part of what will later become the United States? Uh, the title is going to give it away here. It's going to be the Puritans. So, who are Puritans? What's a Puritan? What am I talking about? A Puritan is someone who believes in Puritanism. It is a form of Protestantism. It is a religious sect, a religious branch. It's still Christian. It's still part of that branch of Christianity, but it's distinct, and it's something that emerges around the Protestant Reformation. So, Puritanism, those who are Puritans, those who follow Puritanism believed themselves to be true or godly Protestants. So they start out as Protestants. They love Protestantism. They think it's the best thing ever, but they don't think that it's gone far enough. They think that the Protestantism that is in place is not enough. It hasn't gone far enough. It hasn't done its due diligence. It needs to do more. What I'm saying here is, let me say this again. You remember most people who followed Christianity at this time were practicing Catholics. That was the form of you were a Christian, you were a Catholic. And in 1517, a lot of people became, by 1517, the anger had been building for quite some time with Catholicism. A lot of people disliked the pomp and circumstance of it. They disliked how ornate it was. They disliked how corrupt the Catholic Church had been. And they protested that. It formed their own religious branch. It was a schism. Protestants are protesting the opulence of Catholicism. So if you're a Protestant, you don't like big giant churches. You don't like massive displays of opulence. You don't like how much money the Catholic Church makes. You don't like Mass being read in Latin. You want something very, very simple. And the Puritans really like that. So what happens is England becomes Protestant. The King of England decides that once the Protestant Reformation happens, that's where he thinks that's a great plan, great idea, loves it, breaks with the Catholic Church and declares England Protestant. So the Church of England, which is pictured here, is the new religion in England. England is a Protestant nation. That's what's going on. The Puritans don't think the Church of England has gone far enough. It's not Protestant enough. If you look at that, that's a pretty ornate church. They're still thinking there's too many vestiges of Catholicism left. Everybody says they're not Catholic anymore, but they're just kind of doing it in name. Like they're still wearing ornate robes, they're still having ornate ceremonies, and the Puritans don't like it. They want to purify the Church of England. So they want to purify England's Protestant church. They want to take it a step further. They really want to get rid of any last notes, any vestiges, hints of Catholicism. It has to go out. So they are considered kind of extreme by a lot of Protestants. They're thinking, wow, we haven't gone far enough. Okay, sure. They really want a more human-centric religion. They want everything to be about the individual communing with God. That's another core part of their doctrine. They want to purify the Church of England. They also want to make it more about the individual conversion experience, the individual experiencing their own relationship with God. And they really do prioritize reading of the Bible. Because they want people to be literate, they want them to understand it themselves. They think that's the only true path to salvation. That's the best way to go about being a follower, a practicing uh, Protestant, a practicing Puritan, to read the Bible for yourself. Because if you're a practicing Catholic, a lot of times it's in Latin. A priest is reading it for you. You're just hearing what he's telling you. You don't really get to make a lot of judgments for yourself. So the Puritans want followers to read the Bible, learn for themselves, make their own conclusions, have their own more personal relationship with God. So, quiz question number one, why did the Puritans want to purify the Church of England? So we got the Puritans down. That's what they want. That's what they're going for. That's why they come into existence. A sect of Protestants that want to purify the Protestant church. They think it's still too Catholic and it needs to change. They also have a slightly different doctrine of belief than some other Protestants. The Puritans are also Calvinists. They believe in Calvinism. And this is a belief system that gets its name from a Swiss religious philosopher named John Calvin. And John Calvin had proposed the idea that if God is all powerful and all knowing and omnipresent, then he knows everything that's ever happened and everything that will ever be. Therefore, nothing you do is ever going to change his mind. Those who follow Calvin's beliefs, those who follow Calvinism, believe that those who are saved, those who are going to go to heaven, and those who will be damned and going to hell, has already been preordained by God. This is predestination. This means, and this is what the Puritans believe, that good deeds won't change what God has already decided. God has already looked into your life. He has already looked into your soul. When he made you, he knew it was going to happen. And to question that means that you're questioning God's divine will. So Calvinists felt that because God was all powerful, he'd already decided, and it wasn't going to change anything. Now, there was a lot of belief in Puritan society that if you were a good person outwardly, like you did good deeds and you seemed very nice and you were very devout and pious and kind and generous, that was a sign that you were saved. If you were a terrible person and everybody hated you and you were kind of mean, that might be a sign that you were already damned. So it kind of encourages good behavior in a bit of a roundabout way. But this is the Puritan philosophy. They are Calvinists. They believe in predestination. Question number two, what is Calvinism? So the Puritans talked a lot about them, why they're called the Puritans, why they emerge, what they believe. Where does the phrase pilgrim come in? Pilgrims, you think of the Thanksgiving, like this picture here, you've got the funny hats and the shoes with the buckles. It's very Thanksgiving-y, very fall, very seasonal, very nice. Where does this come in? How do Puritans become pilgrims? What's the relationship here? Well, a pilgrim can apply to anybody who moves around for religious purposes. If you make a pilgrimage to a holy site, you are a pilgrim. Sometimes people who move because of persecution from one place to another declare themselves pilgrims. They've made a pilgrimage motivated by religion. So the term pilgrim is not limited solely to this part in US history here. And almost anybody moving for a religious purpose, whether it's just a trip or whether it's relocating themselves, can be a pilgrim. So, how does this term get applied to the Puritans? How did the Puritans become pilgrims? Well, there's a group of Puritans who become pilgrims when they leave England because they felt that they were unable to fully practice their religion there. In 1608, there were a group of Puritans, and I'm going to mix these two up, so watch out. There were a group of Puritans who became pilgrims when they leave England for the Netherlands. They make a pilgrimage out of their home country because they were very concerned that they simply felt that they could not sit idly by while England continued to allow Catholic practices to continue. It's important to note that there's a weird misconception that the Pilgrims left for religious freedom, like they left like they were being persecuted and hunted down and killed. They were not. They were actually considered pretty insufferable by a lot of people around them, but they kind of put up with them. The Puritans leave not because they're being persecuted, but because they feel that in good conscience, as good Puritans, they can't sit around and leave the Church of England unpurified. It's not purifying quick enough. It's not happening. They have to just go because it's sitting poorly on their consciences. So they leave in order to be free from what they feel to be very idolatrous practices going on, that they're saving themselves by escaping this corruption. So they leave England for the Netherlands. But eventually, by the 1620s, they're unhappy in the Netherlands. And they're unhappy there mostly because they feel that their culture is being eroded. They had been very proud to be members of the empire, the English Empire there. They were happy to be English. They didn't really want to leave, but they felt obligated by their religious motives. So they weren't super happy in the Netherlands because they feel that they're becoming less English. You have children when you live in the Netherlands, they're going to start speaking Dutch. They felt that everything was just kind of falling apart. They thought, no, 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 this is not going to work. Yes, we're practicing our religion, we're happy here, but we're losing a core part of our identity, our English identity. They want to go be English somewhere and be able to be Puritan in English. So in 1620, a very famous ship called the Mayflower takes 150 Puritans who are now pilgrims because they're moving to North America. So the movement is what makes someone a pilgrim. They go to North America. Their goal in 1620 is to hook up somewhere in the vague vicinity of Jamestown. They're thinking there are other English people there. They're not Puritans, but they're English. We'll be close enough to them to trade, close enough to them to maybe do some business, but we'll park ourselves far enough away so that they won't corrupt us. They get way off course. I mean, you really can't get much more off course than this. You're heading for Virginia and you end up in like Massachusetts, you made a wrong turn somewhere. And that's what they do. But when they get there, they're thinking, okay, well, we'll be able to be Puritan freely here without a single ounce of corruption to be found. Okay, so this is quiz question number 3. Why did the Puritans become pilgrims and leave England? So what happens when they crash into New England up there, what we now know as New England? They settle to create a colony where they can practice Puritanism without the corruption around them. They're not escaping persecution, they're escaping corruption. And the colony that the Puritans settle in 1620 when the Mayflower arrives is known as the Plymouth Colony. And it is independent. It's its own colony governed by the settlers there. It's not attached to any other colony, it's its own entity. And the idea of this, why they kind of really like it when they get there, they're thinking, oh, this is great. They like it because it's a chance to create what they call a city on a hill. This is a very strong motivating factor for the Puritans. They want to create a city on a hill because they're hoping to be an example to others about the perfect society. The city on a hill it's a metaphor. They're not really like building on high ground or anything. It's not actually a city upon a hill. It's this idea that they will be this wonderful, perfect, beautiful society. And because they have this chance to do this, it will provide an opportunity for other people to look at them and give them something to emulate, give them something to copy. They're going to create a society like you've never seen before, so perfect, so holy, so devout, so well run that everyone will want to be just like it. And this is their chance to do so. This is their laboratory, their experimental grounds to do this in a spot where they are free to make sure that this is going to work. And one of the things they do when they get there is they're, okay, we're going to make a city on a hill. And they draw up a set of rules that they say they're going to follow. And it's known as the Mayflower Compact. Now, the Mayflower Compact is very important because it is considered one of those firsts that historians really love. It is one of the first governing documents that has representational government in it. When the Puritans draw up the Mayflower Compact, in it, they declare that they are going to follow laws that their representatives make. They're going to have a representative government. That's very different than a monarchy where a king just says the rules and you follow them or else. A representative government is a participatory government where people can choose their leaders because they think that they're going to make good rules and they agree to follow those rules. It's a much more symbiotic relationship and it gives people a chance to participate in their government, choose the people who are going to make their laws. If they're going to have to follow the laws, they're going to get a say in who's going to make them. Just like the House of Burgesses and the Iroquois Confederacy, this is another link in the chain of self-government, of the Republican idea of self-government that people will eventually look to trace once the United States becomes the United States, once America wants to be independent. So the Mayflower Compact is another one of those shining examples of something very democratic emerging in these colonies that will eventually be seen as maybe a beginning of democracy. So the Mayflower Compact is very important for that. When the Puritans on the Mayflower land in what's now Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay, they land there in 1620, of course. They create Plymouth, and this is where the whole Plymouth Rock thing comes into play. Uh, I don't know how true that really is. That's a lot of conjecture about that. But either way, technically, you can still go visit Plymouth Rock. I guess the rumor is that this is where they disembarked the Mayflower, and it was like the first rock they came across and decided that that was special for some reason. Regardless, you can still go visit it. I don't recommend it. It's super boring, and they keep the rock in a weird cage. I mean, maybe they're worried it's going to run away. Someone's going to steal it. Yeah, and run off with that one. But Plymouth becomes this independent colony once they land there, and it maintains its independence for quite some time until 1691. It is merged with another English colony that was in the same area, known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And we're going to explore that in just a little bit, what I'm talking about with this Massachusetts Bay Colony and why they merge. So let's see. Quiz question number 4. What was the Mayflower Compact? All right, Massachusetts Bay Colony. What is that? This is another colony founded in along the East Coast in the New England area by other English settlers. They have a different motive than the settlers of the Plymouth colony. If you could see here on the map, Plymouth colony was the big arm of Massachusetts that kind of goes out into the ocean. That was the one that the Puritans settled in 1620. In 1629, another group of English settlers who are they're Puritans, but they have a little bit different motivation. They settle the Massachusetts Bay Colony up here. And you can see how eventually that's going to turn into one big state that's going to be Massachusetts. But they're two separate colonies for a while. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded in 1629 with a different goal than Plymouth. Plymouth was all about being the city on a hill. It was going to be this perfect religious society where the Puritans can show everybody that this was the right and proper way to run just a country. This was the right way to run a settlement, the right way that people should act and be. The Massachusetts Bay Colony has a very different goal, a very different start. In 1629, a group called the Massachusetts Bay Company, which is run by London merchants, creates this colony because they want to make money. They want to rake in the cash. They are hoping that this will be a profitable trade settlement and that they are going to be able to bring in wealth from agriculture, trade, furs, whatever they can do. They just want to make some money with it. And it is a very popular destination. A lot of English settlers end up landing in this area in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay Colony, especially Massachusetts Bay, because they want to make money too. Between 1630 and 1642, there is a massive influx of settlers known as the Great Migration. These are all people coming from England to settle in Massachusetts Bay area. About 21,000 arrive during this time. So that's it's a large number of people making their way across the ocean there to populate this. The population grows quite a bit in that time period. And we'll talk a little bit about this more when we talk about the Salem witch trials, but part of the reason why these two very disparate colonies end up joining, a lot of it is going to be due to the English crown, the English ruler attempting to consolidate power. So we're going to unpack that a little bit later. But just know that these were two very different settlements from the beginning with two very different goals. Okay, where are we with quiz questions? Five. Question five. Okay. What was the goal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony? Why was it founded? So let's look at this. We talked about they want to go, they want to make money. How are they going to make money? What are they going to do to make said cash? The economy in New England, in the Massachusetts, Rhode Island area, which will all eventually be settled by the English, it's going to look vastly different from the Chesapeake, what they're going to be doing to be making money down further south. So where's the money at up in New England? It is fishing, a lot of cod, fishing in the Atlantic, very lucrative because cod is supposedly very good if you dry it and it lasts very long. I've never had dried cod. I can't attest to that. There's also a lot of timber to be harvested from the forests of New England. And along with that, also shipbuilding. A lot of the timber and logs and forest products are very good for building ships. And if you've ever driven around anywhere up in New England, you'll come across roads with names like Mast Street, M-A-S-T, like a big mast for a ship. Those big old trees that the English merchants come and find there are perfect for making masts of ships. They're long, tall, straight, a perfect ship mast. All you have to do is cut it down and knock some of the branches off. That's some of the things that are being done for trading. You can go fishing, you can get lots of fish, you can sell and trade that. But a lot of the economy isn't really stuff that people are selling. A lot of the economy is self-sufficient. There are a lot of family farms that don't really engage in the global economy. They are simply growing enough product to meet the demands of their own families. A lot of them are just, they're growing crops that they need, maybe a little bit to trade with their neighbors, but that's about it. And because of this, because if you've noticed, there's no big massive cash crop. They're not growing tobacco up there. It's not warm enough. The New England area, Massachusetts, does not require the same amount of labor that the Chesapeake does. And therefore, this region does not have a lot of enslaved labor, nor does it have a lot of indentured servants. This is another thing that's going to make it different from the Chesapeake is going to be not just the economy, what they're doing to make money, but the labor system in that economy. In this case, it's going to be just people and their families, parents and children kind of working on farms, maybe men going off to make money fishing or building ships, but there's just not enough there to require that massive extra labor source like the Chesapeake does. And if you remember what I was going on about in whatever it was lecture I was going on about this in, that was part of what makes the Chesapeake such a unappealing origin story for the United States because it has slavery. It has indentured servitude and people getting whipped because they're to expand their indenture and they're getting bought and sold. And you have those advertisements about the Irish servant girl getting sold to someone else because there was still a term left on her indenture. It's not very appealing. The idea of self-sufficient farmers and hardworking shipbuilders and timber harvesters makes a much nicer, much more appealing beginning, a much nicer lore for a country to begin on. Okay, uh, quiz question number six. What were some of the features or characteristics of the New England economy? So we're looking at the economy. Now we're going to look at the Puritan family or the Puritan social structure because it is a unique one. Maybe not simply unique to the Puritans, not necessarily right to them, but to a lot of English settlers. And this is definitely something that the Puritans adhere to, is this type of family structure. So the Puritans, another one of their beliefs was they were believed in something known as the Great Chain of Being, and this is what this little art piece here depicts. They believe that there is a divine social hierarchy in place that separates people into different levels, that there is inequality and it's just natural and that's how things are. It's ordained, it's okay. People are all different, they fall into different categories. The Puritan social hierarchy essentially puts God at the very top, who he's up there in this image here. Then the next level of people are nobles, kings, priests, the educated, and then humans just naturally fall into a hierarchy of essentially men on top, then women, then children, then slaves, then animals, and then, rocks, trees, and it just keeps going down basically to Satan there. And there's nothing wrong with that in the Puritan mindset. That is simply the great chain of being. That is how God set up the world, and that's how it's supposed to be. So naturally, their society is going to be a patriarchy, which means that men are considered superior to women. Patriarchy, patriarch, man, that's how it is set up. But that does not mean that Puritan women were without rights. They were subservient, but they were not so subservient that they were, considered to be enslaved themselves, we'll say. Puritan women actually had a lot more rights than maybe people would assume. They had legalized divorce, so if you were a Puritan woman and your husband was overtly cruel or did not care for you or was, couldn't provide for you and your family or hurt your children, you could petition to get a divorce from him and you would most likely be granted it. Puritan women also had the opportunity to become what is known as a deputy husband, where they could rise up to the position of being the husband in the family if the circumstances arose. Usually, this meant that if your husband was very sick or away on business, everybody in your community was obligated to treat you, the wife, with the same respect that they would have given your husband. Because the idea is that your husband married you because he trusted you to do business when he was away or unable to do so. And if you didn't respect someone's wife, that was a sign that you didn't respect her husband either. So it actually got women a fair amount of respect in society because the idea was is that a man chose her to help. You need to respect him, and to do that, you have to respect her. There are a lot of accounts in journals and logbooks of women doing some pretty serious business. My husband's away, he's out in the woods for weeks on end harvesting timber and shipping it, or he's a sailor maybe, he's out fishing and trading. People have to anything that they want from him, they have to get through her because she's going to be the one at home. She's going to be the one doing business on his behalf while he is away. She has become the deputy husband. She has risen to the position of the husband and needs to be respected as such. Quiz question 7. What is a deputy husband? Okay, so I want to talk now a little bit about some issues that the Puritans face in regards to indigenous populations that they're going to encounter. Because I've kind of set them up as a society, their family, their religious beliefs, their economy, but they don't encounter a barren, empty landscape when they arrive in New England. They are going to encounter indigenous societies that are already present there. And their relationship with them is going to be more complex than, I guess, that first Thanksgiving imagery. And what I always appreciate about this topic too is that it does complicate that nice narrative where this is supposed to be the cleaner version of the American origin story, that if relations with Native Americans were poor down in the Chesapeake, that they were supposedly somehow better up north. And that's not the case. And here's evidence of that. One of the conflicts that the Puritan settlements faced was a conflict with the Pequot indigenous group, and this was called the Pequot War. This occurred in about the 1630s. These types of wars kind of ebb and flow, and they last usually for several years. But the Pequot War began when the Massachusetts Bay colonists they arrive, they establish themselves, and they decide that they are going to start allying themselves with some of the various indigenous groups they encounter in order to strengthen their own position. So the Massachusetts Bay colonists decide to make allies of the Narragansett people and the Mohegan. And when they do that, when they ally with them, they make enemies of the Narragansett and Mohegan's enemy, the Pequot. So the Pequot were already an enemy of the Narragansett and Mohegan. When the Massachusetts colonists joined the Narragansett and Mohegan, they've naturally just made an enemy of the Pequot now. Part of the reason why the Pequot are at odds with these other groups is because the Pequot have allied themselves with the Dutch. So they were kind of a natural enemy of the English anyway at this point because the English were at odds with the Dutch. So you can see how they're falling into categories. Regardless, the English and the Pequot have now found themselves at odds, and by the 1630 by 1637, this conflict actually turns into a real on-out war. It just doesn't become just an alliance against the Pequot. It actually becomes a fight because the there is a lot of tension over land expansion, more colonists, lack of resources, a lot of things we've already discussed in regard to things like the Anglo-Powhatan War. But the in 1637, the English decide that they're going to help the Narragansett and Mohegan actively fight the Pequot, and the result is pretty devastating. These indigenous groups had been having conflict for several centuries, and it had been kind of just a way to reestablish control and boundaries of the region. The English see it as a war of extermination. They see this as an opportunity to help remove the Pequot and take the land. So they fight really dirty when a conflict emerges in 1637. And the result is that about a quarter of the Pequot population is killed in the ensuing fight. The English are there, they have superior weapons, and they are not afraid to use it. A lot of historic accounts say that they kind of bring this dirty fighting techniques that they learned when they were trying to subdue the Irish, and they do the same thing to the Pequot. They have really no mercy for the Pequot people, and almost they kill about they I think yeah, they over a quarter of the population is dead by the end of this. The rest are kind of scattered. They're almost causing an extinction here. It's a pretty significant event. A lot of the survivors are enslaved and made to work in English households, so they really destroy the Pequot culture as a result of this conflict. Some of them are even resettled. They're enslaved and settled into the Caribbean, so they're sent very far away from New England. And another result of this is not just the decimation, really, of Pequot society. It's also a realization for a lot of other indigenous groups that the English are not simply another nation to work into their existing power structures. The English are there for their own purposes. They're not an ally that can really be trusted, and they're an ally that is going to be extremely brutal and extremely volatile. So that is a couple of the results of the war against the Pequot. Quiz question number 8. What was the result of the Pequot War? And that is not the only war that happens between the English settlers in New England and the indigenous societies that are in place there. There's another later conflict known as King Philip's War, and it gets this name after the indigenous leader of the Wampanoag. His it goes by two names. There's kind of the indigenous name and the more anglicized name he's given. His indigenous name is Metacom, but the English call him King Philip. And this is a chain of events. What causes King Philip's War starts with a chain of events that begins in 1675. So what happens in this conflict is that these two groups, the Wampanoag and the English, they're starting to get at odds over a lot of different things, over allocation of resources, over land use, over the English expanding their territory. And a lot of it too is about the fact that the English really they're not obeying the treaties that they make with the Wampanoag that say like, okay, we promise we will only take this amount of land, and then they break that treaty almost immediately and take more land than they were supposed to. But it really comes to a head. What really kicks this off is in 1675, the English settlers execute 3 Wampanoag people. And the reason they do that is because it's kind of a long, weird story, but I'll tell it anyway. They execute these three people because there had been a murder in one of the English settlements. There was a Wampanoag named John Sassamon, and John Sassamon had become what is known as a praying Indian, Pray, like you're praying. So he was someone who had converted to Christianity and gone to live amongst the English. So John Sassamon was a Wampanoag living amongst the English, and John Sassamon one day is found dead. The English immediately assume that it must have been some of the other Wampanoag that had murdered John Sassamon for having betrayed them somehow or for having neglected his original culture to live amongst the English and adopt Christianity. There is a very poor trial that goes on for the murder of John Sassamon, and his murderers are the Wampanoag. They're suspected to be them. So for that murder of John Sassamon, those three Wampanoag are executed. The Wampanoag are understandably upset about this. They feel that there was not a proper trial, that the English had no right to kill them for the suspected murder, and tensions go even higher. The native alliances of the Wampanoag and their allies attack a lot of New England settlements, a lot of Puritan settlements that have been encroaching further and further inland, and now it's a war. So the tension had been there, but that execution of those Wampanoag accused of murdering John Sassamon, that's the powder keg. That's what blows this up. That's the spark that really starts all out war between these two populations. Eventually, this ends when the English capture Metacom. They capture King Philip about a year later. They are pretty ruthless. They want to make an example of this. So what they do is they execute him, they hang him, so hang him from a noose, then they cut his head off, and then they take his body and they draw and quarter it. So you get four horses and you put a rope on around either horse's neck, and then you tie those ropes to the arms and legs of the body and you send those four horses in four different directions. So not only do they kill King Philip, but they brutalize his corpse in the hopes that they will send a message to any other indigenous societies to not do this again, to not uh, encroach on their culture, on their settlements, to not attack settlements, to stay away, and to not challenge the growing English authority in the region. So the English have killed a lot of Wampanoag during this conflict, and the result is that they do have more unencumbered access to the land because they have lowered the population of indigenous Wampanoag in the region and made it easier to expand themselves. Quiz question number 9. What caused King Philip's War? All right, so it's not just conflict with indigenous groups that are causing trouble in the Puritan settlements up in New England. They are also start to fight amongst themselves. They start to disagree on some things, and it becomes clear that this is not the perfect society or perfect city on a hill that they had hoped it would be. This is most apparent in the case of Anne Hutchinson. Give a little bit of background on her. So Anne Hutchinson, she's a Puritan, and she becomes a pilgrim because she leaves England and travels to settle in Massachusetts. And she does this with her family, her husband and her kids, in 1634. They arrive in Massachusetts, and Anne Hutchinson quickly establishes herself as someone who really wants to be part of the church. You know, she's part of the Puritan church. She wants to be active in it, and she starts holding meetings in her home after sermons where she and her friends and her neighbors discuss scripture. So I'm imagining there's plenty of reports of it, but in my head I always picture, Anne Hutchinson goes to church, she goes back home after church, and then she and her friends talk about what they heard. But in those meetings in her home, they're not just talking about what they heard or repeating what they heard. They're debating it. And Anne Hutchinson's neighbors start to get a little concerned about some of the things going on during her discussions, some of the things she's talking about. In some of her meetings, she starts to question what the local pastors have been saying in their sermons. In Anne Hutchinson's mind, she voices this to her neighbors during these meetings. She says, I think they're preaching the wrong thing. I think they're saying the wrong stuff. Because in Hannah Hutchinson's mind, what she is hearing is it sounds a lot like these sermons have gone into the territory of telling people to do good deeds, be a good person, do the right thing, and that will get you into heaven. And in Anne Hutchinson's mind, that's not what they should be saying. She's a true Calvinist. She thinks that everything is preordained. So the local minister should not be telling people to do good deeds because that's not going to make a difference. God has already decided. If you tell people what you do will change the course of your trip up or down when you die, that's wrong. And a lot of people don't take very well to Anne Hutchinson's accusation that the local ministers are preaching the wrong thing. She is besmirching them. She is slandering them. She's smearing their reputations and eventually gets placed on trial for this. She is found guilty of what essentially amounts to disrupting the peace, disturbing the stability of the society. And as a punishment, Anne Hutchinson and her family are banished. That's the best punishment ever, I think. That's what a weird punishment. It just tells people to go away. That's what happens to Anne Hutchinson. They are banished from the community because she is too much of a disruptive presence. She is making people question authority, and in a patriarchal society, it is a woman questioning that great chain of being. She should be deferring to the men that are in positions of power. Her family are they're banished to New Netherlands, so they're sent down to the Dutch territories, and eventually, several years later, they are killed in that Kiefts War, that conflict between the Dutch and the indigenous societies down there. But this is a shining example of how the Puritans did not handle dissent very well. They did not tolerate it whatsoever. This is not a religiously free society. Everyone thinks, oh, they came here for religious freedom. No, they came here to do their own thing. And if you didn't follow them, you were out. You were banished or killed. There's a story about a group of Puritans, a Puritan community, that had a group of Quakers come, and the Quakers were all about peace and talking about an inner light and how everybody has the ability to commune with God and everybody has this power to do well and improve themselves. Puritans don't like that message, so they hang them. They are not for religious freedom for all. They want it for themselves, and they want to make sure that they are doing it in a spot where they can do it and feel that they are not being corrupted. So, and the Anne Hutchinson case is a fantastic example of this. They're not a very free religious society. They have a very strict doctrine and a very strict adherence to that. And anybody who challenges it, anybody who challenges the great chain of being or authority, is going to be dealt with swiftly, especially because it's just disrupting the stability of their society. It can't be a city on a hill. It can't be perfect if you have people like Anne Hutchinson questioning the ability of preachers to say the correct doctrine, questioning their authority. Final quiz question number 10. Who was Anne Hutchinson? Why was she in trouble? All right, so that concludes this lecture. Next time, the next lecture is going to be on some other issues that they're going to be facing up in New England, notably the Salem witch trials.